New York Daily News Washington Bureau Chief Cameron Joseph is in Washington, good enough to join us now. And Cameron, let's start there. The inside information that we hear that President-elect Donald Trump has that, again, proves that Russia was not behind this hacking. Do you have any sense of what kind of information it is that we're talking about?
I don't. None of us do. And frankly, I'll believe it when I see it. Donald Trump is getting intelligence briefings. He has a lot more information than a lot of us. There could be some information out there that backs up what he's saying, but he's made these promises before where he says, I'm going to give you some information. I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to say this or that. And then there's no follow-up. And we credulously report on this, expecting that there's actually something there. And then he kind of just drops it afterwards. So if he does come out with new information, I'd love to see it. As far as I know and what I've heard from my sources, I mean, the intelligence community is pretty much on board that Russia was behind these hacks. The question of their motivations is a different one. But until I see something, until Donald Trump actually puts out what he's promising to put out, I think we all need to look at this a little bit skeptically. And he's been denying that Russia's behind this from the start. So I think we really need to keep leaning on this.
It's an intelligence community with which Donald Trump will need to be aligned. Also, Cameron, we're increasingly seeing, an increasingly bipartisan group that stands now opposed. I mean, we heard Republican Senator Tom Cotton, one of Donald Trump's staunchest surrogates, saying that Vladimir Putin, for instance, needs new boundaries drawn for him in direct response to this hacking in question. Can Donald Trump increasingly and his administration exist on the island it seems they now sit upon?
Well, I think it's an open question. I think it's really notable that Republicans do seem to be really showing some spine on this. And, Lindsey Graham and John McCain have been kind of leading this effort for a while. But other Republicans who were a little cagier and being a little more cautious about this earlier on, including, you mentioned Tom Cotton, I think more notable even as Paul Ryan came out praising, criticizing Obama, but saying that the sanctions that he just put in place against Russia were appropriate if overdue. So you're seeing a consensus Democrat and a lot of Republican on the Hill. But Donald Trump is the one who's going to actually have these sanctions in place. The question is whether he can just ignore Congress or whether there's actually going to be a political price to pay on this. He really is the one who has most of the power. The question is if Congress passes new Russia sanctions, what he does. And if he vetoes that, that could set up a really big fight, and probably not the way that he wants to be spending the first couple of months in office. But I'm not positive that the Republican-controlled Congress is going to spend all that much time on that.
We heard the incoming press secretary, Sean Spicer, reiterate this again today, that it's the belief of many within the Trump administration coming that these sanctions were political retribution by the Obama administration. Is there a case to be made here?
Well, obviously, the hacks that it seems pretty clear that Russia was behind did hurt President Obama's party and hurt Democrats, targeted Democrats. But the fact that this went after our democracy, and this did damage to Americans' trust in government. And while the election itself obviously wasn't hacked, the fact that major campaign folks were hacked, including not just Democrats, but John McCain's and Lindsey Graham's campaigns went after too, other folks who have been pretty critical of Russia. So the idea that this is political retribution, I can see the argument of why Democrats were attacked and Democrats are responding, but making this a political football I think could be a little bit dangerous. And I think both sides need to really focus on the fact that this is a foreign country that's messing with our government right now.
Again, we stand fewer than 24 hours away from a new Congress being sworn in, one with which Donald Trump will have to work, but also one that does have a significant GOP majority at this point. If the Affordable Care Act is issue number one for it, what do you expect in these first days as it regards it?
Well, I think the Affordable Care Act is obviously number one with a bullet in terms of things that Republicans can agree they don't like. The question is how they handle repealing that, whether they do a gradual repeal, a repeal and delay like they're talking about now. They haven't been able to get on the same page in terms of what they're actually going to replace it with. And Tom Price is going to be moving into the administration, has been a leading voice in the House talking about ways that he thinks that they need to actually replace this. The question is whether House and Senate Republicans can get on the same page with the new Trump administration and do that. And I think there's going to be a lot of other regulations they're looking at cutting. EPA regulations, some of the Wall Street reform regulations from Dodd-Frank that they've made major targets. So they're going to be trying to move very quickly. The question is whether they can all be on the same page and how much Democratic support they can get for any of this. Because some of these things you can do just with Republicans. With reconciliation, you don't need a supermajority, but some of these things you are going to need some Democratic support. And there are 48 Democrats. A lot of them are up for re-election next time around. A lot of them are red state senators. So you're looking at 8 Democrats you could theoretically pick off with. But the question is whether the House, which is very conservative, and the Senate, which is going to need some Democrats in some of these things and are going to have to keep their few moderate Republicans in line, are going to be able to get on the same page. And that's an open question at this point.
So that same page, we know that Nancy Pelosi will be speaking to senior Democrats in the House today. We know the president is scheduled to do roughly the same thing tomorrow as it regards, it's thought, the Affordable Care Act. How staunch, then, can resistance be here?
I think that's an open question as well. And I don't think it's going to be coming from Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats because they frankly have zero power in unified Trump administration, Republican Congress, except for the power to basically make news and talk about, point out things that they don't like Republicans are doing. But on the Senate side, it's going to be fascinating to watch because, as I mentioned, there are 8 Democrats in seats from states that Donald Trump won that are going to be facing re-election in less than 2 years, including some really deep red states like West Virginia. And they are the ones that Republicans are going to need to pick off to really do some of these big things, not just changing financial stuff, but bigger, more sweeping program changes, including to the Affordable Care Act. And they have a lot of cross pressures. They really are facing some tough situations back home. At the same time, they're only going to do things that help them politically. And there are still enough moderate Republicans that are going to be resistant to things that I think that Mitch McConnell has a very small needle to thread here on some of these issues. It's going to be fascinating to watch.
And so it shall begin again fewer than 24 hours from now. Cameron Joseph there in Washington, we very much appreciate the insight.
Thanks for having me.